I'm Bob Myers, President Emeritus of the National Press Foundation. Our guest today is Laurie Garrett, Senior Fellow for Global Health at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Laurie is also an award-winning reporter and author. Laurie, great to see you again.
Wonderful.
In 1996, you received the Pulitzer for explanatory journalism. The committee that awarded it described you as conducting courageous reporting on Ebola when you were in Zaire. What was it like on the ground?
Well, those were the days when Mobutu Sese Seko was the brutal dictator who'd been in power for decades and had looted his country of every single thing of value that he could get his hands on. In fact, about a year after the Ebola epidemic, he died, and they, opened the bank vaults, and there was nothing there. It had all, flown off to Switzerland to these unmarked accounts. His brutality was legion, to so much as wink badly was enough to get you locked up and tortured. And his response to the confirmation that the strange, mysterious disease occurring in the town of Kikwit was Ebola was to do two things. First, he went to Switzerland, and second, he had the military cut off N1, the only major highway that would reach Kikwit. So there was absolutely no truck traffic, buses, anything. There was no land means to get there. And this essentially isolated the people with their own misery and made it almost impossible to get supplies and international teams and, of course, reporters in there.
How did you get around?
Well, that's an interesting story. I made my way to Kinshasa, the capital city of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. And like many other journalists, I was stuck there. The day I arrived, a whole group of journalists that had talked someone into flying them en masse to Kikwit jumped out, run around, done reporting, looked for people with Ebola to take pictures of them and their suffering, and then jumped back on planes, had been held by the military at the Kinshasa airport and were on the tarmac in the brutal heat at gunpoint. So I arrived knowing, okay, the usual routes are not going to be working to get in there. I was determined to get in one way or another, and I was working with people I knew from WHO, from the American Centers for Disease Control, and a variety of other places. And as it turned out, ABC News was quite committed to the story, and they asked me if I would come on board as a sort of consultant. And in exchange, they were supposedly going to get a jet that would fly in to Kikwit. The producer was throwing money around Kinshasa that was in such large quantities that everybody in Zaire wanted to meet ABC.
You could say those were the days.
Those were the days. And of course, the result was that many people made promises of planes that were never there. And ultimately, ABC realized that they'd blown it. Their whole strategy of getting in wasn't going to work. Well, meanwhile, the evangelical hero, Pat Robertson, showed up in town. And one of the ABC people knew him. And they felt badly that they'd really screwed it up for me. So they basically told Pat Robertson that I needed to get in. And if Pat had room on his plane, I was vital to the response.
A great story.
And I was put on a World War II era beat-up plane, tied to the cargo in the back. The great shipment of evangelical donations from the 700 Club turned out to be a few boxes of aspirin and some Band-Aids, none of which was going to be particularly useful in the Ebola epidemic. And the pilots regaled me with tales of their primary task with this plane, owned by Pat Robertson, was moving his diamonds around And then he had a diamond mine operation in Angola and one in Zaire, and a very good relationship with the great President Mobutu. But we landed on a soccer field, and folks came pouring out from everywhere. Who's this foreigner coming out of a plane on the soccer field? And it just took off from there. And I stayed in Kikwit. I moved in actually to an old monastery where the Catholics had not successfully recruited very many wannabe priests, so there were plenty of empty rooms.
If we see pictures of people with Ebola today, and especially healthcare workers, we see them all garbed up in spacesuits and protective booties and eyeglasses and masks and whatnot. Was that available to you?
No.
So did you wear or in any way protect yourself in covering that story there?
Well, I use common sense. There was only 2 occasions when I realized my common sense had failed me.
Oh dear, and yet you're still here.
One was, I came to feel that the real heroes of that particular epidemic were the local Red Cross volunteers who risked their lives to remove sick people from belligerent households.
What do you mean by belligerent households?
Well, very few people wanted their loved one removed from them.
Okay.
And fights would ensue, often infecting the Red Cross worker in the process.
Got it.
All they had for protective gear were a couple of flimsy masks, some rubber boots, and aprons. So I was following them around and observing their activities. And at one point, they had to resort to mass burials because, of course, the bodies are highly contaminated, and it's very dangerous. The primary transmission outside of hospital settings is funerals. And they were doing a mass burial, and I was trying to photograph it for my newspaper, and realized that the sun wasn't right, and got on just the perfect position to take the picture. And then at the moment I took the picture, I realized that body bag is dripping. There's blood coming out of that body bag. And the same second I realized that, I'm downwind. This is dumb. So I pulled out a mask and put it on. And the second time I was taking a small crew, a driver, a translator, an ailing scientist who was supposed to be leading the team, but he was having an acute reaction to malaria medication that made him psychotic. And we were out in the hinterlands looking to trace the whole course of the epidemic. How did it start? Who gave it to whom? How did it get from village to village? And to identify whether or not there were still any active cases in any of the more remote areas. And I was trying to have the team feel like a team, even though we were all strangers to each other, because our lives depended on each other doing the right things. And we were going to be out camping out and everything for days. In the bush, and we had to be sure we found safe water and all the usual things, right? And so part of the collegiality was, well, we'll all eat together. But the style of eating in Congo is one big bowl of food and everybody puts their hands in. And we were about to eat, and I thought, it's not hot, it's actually kind of lukewarm. So if there's a virus in there, it's probably not, or if somebody has virus on their hands, and they reach in, and then I take the next, this is probably not a good idea. So I said, I said, let's all pause for one moment. And I pulled out some latex gloves, and I said, we have no idea if any of us might have been exposed. And it could be me. I'm not saying it's just you guys. So let's all put these gloves on and eat. And it wasn't until I had put my hands in a couple of times that I remembered, in oil, latex falls apart. And pretty soon we all had this, oh my goodness, what have we done to ourselves? It was awful.
So So that then leads to another question about your science background, because you did a great deal of study. You studied biology in college and graduate studies at Berkeley and graduate research at Stanford. So how did you go so wrong and end up in journalism?
A couple things. First of all, my department, I was in the department that doesn't exist anymore, immunology and bacteriology at Berkeley. And there was kind of internecine warfare going on within the faculty. It was a department in transition without clear leadership, and the graduate students were having a hard time getting a quorum of faculty to sit for approval of your dissertation themes and even assigning you to a mentor. It was awful. And secondly, one of my roommates in one of the typical grad student giant household was being courted by the news director of the local Pacifica radio station, KPFA. And when he would sit around waiting for her, because she was being courted by someone else as well.
Men are such pigs.
Yeah, he would sit around waiting for her to prove his true ardor. He would deign to talk to me, you know. And I would tell him about science. And he said, you know, you're really good at explaining this stuff. Why don't you come down to the radio station and start explaining science? I did, and I enjoyed it. It was a nice hobby. And then
was that your first job as a journalist?
No.
Oh, okay.
I had been part of a radio news team when I was in undergrad, but not a big deal. So I did, and then one of the directors of the station came up and said, you know, we're getting a lot of good feedback about when you're on the air, and lots of people call in, and we'd like you to do a show, but since you've never done a show before, we're teaming you up with this person. So here's Addie Gevins. Meet Addie Gevins. Addie Gevins, meet Laurie Garrett. You two are going to work together. So I'm, okay, interesting. Who is this person? And Addie turned out to have won just about every darned award broadcast radio can give for a documentary she'd done called 12 Billion Seconds Later, that was the story of Timothy Leary and LSD.
Oh, wow.
And she turned out to also have a background in the sciences, in primatology from MIT. And but it was wacky, completely wacky. So we were a perfect combo. And we did this series called The Science Story, where we pulled out the stops. You probably have some viewers who are familiar with Radiolab on NPR. Sure. And you think that's so innovative. They're just stealing what we did way back when. I mean, we would do things like, at one point I was trying to explain why influenza could be so dangerous, and how it was so difficult to anticipate when would a pandemic strain arise, because they mutate all the time. And so I got the entire radio station in the studio and had them start chanting, mutate, mutate, and then we sped it up so it's all the little mutate, mutate, mutate.
It's the chipmunks.
So it's supposed to be, you know, chipmunk viruses, I don't know. But it was all things along those lines, and it was serious science, and it was funny, and it was all mixed together. And we did it for a year, and that was great. And then I moved on, got a job working in the Jerry Brown administration, the first one. In assessing human health impacts of pesticides. When I got a phone call saying, hi, this is Athens, Georgia. You know why I'm calling? I said, actually, no. I have no idea. Well, you just won the Peabody Award. I said, oh, is that a big deal? What is that? I called up Addie and said, this guy from Georgia just called and said we won something called a Peabody Award, and I'm still having hearing problems from her screaming.
So the Peabody, for those who don't know, is a major award in broadcast journalism, television.
Television and radio. And the year we won, and the ceremony was at the Hotel Pierre in New York, and I had never been in New York. And what a way to be in New York, right? And it's 1977 or 78, this is disco era. This is New York at its worst. You know, the bankrupt city and all that. And when we went from where we were crashing to the hotel, the cabbie was like something out of Saturday Night Fever. You know, the guy had like the glitter hat on. He had quadraphonic stereo in his cab. He was playing the Bee Gees, and he's, you know, and he's driving through, and he says, "So, you going to the Pierre? What are you girls? You hookers? Is that what it is?"
And then you said, "No, we're journalists." So, is background in science, do you think, necessary to be a science reporter, or can one pick this up as you go along?
One of the greatest science reporters in the world today, still working every day and filing every day at, I believe, 94 years of age, is David Perlman.
Yeah.
He's with the San Francisco Chronicle and has been with the San Francisco Chronicle since, I think, 1950, something like
terrific.
that.
He's spoken in some of our programs.
David's background, zero science. Grew up in New York, went off to fight in World War II. Ended up in Paris, interested in writing for the International Herald Tribune, which was then called something else. And he got the bug. He got the bug of journalism. And he came back, and the biggest thing he thought in the whole world was Sputnik. And it changed his whole life. He said, wow, the Russians have put a satellite up there, and they beat us to it. And it's up there going around the world now. And, you know, you have to think back to the 1950s when there was nothing artificial orbiting. Everything up there was a mystery. And other than a handful of chimps we'd sent up in space, no one had seen it. We hadn't polluted our entire atmosphere with garbage and, you know, dead satellites yet, as we have now. So, as humans, you know, every new place we go to, we turn into a pollution pigsty, and we've done that to space.
So would David be an exception to the rule, or he proves the rule that you don't need a science background?
Actually, I would say his generation were overwhelmingly science reporters with no training in science. My generation was about half and half. And now the younger 20-somethings that I see doing science reporting are all folks with serious science experience. Many have PhDs.
So that's the way journalism itself has changed as more information becomes more easily available to more people.
That may be part of it. I also think it's that the nature of what people are trying to cover in the sciences has become much more complicated, especially in biology. You know, when I was in biology and working in the lab at Stanford, we had a pretty simplistic view of how the human body worked, of how the different elements of the immune system worked, and what DNA did, and all of that. And today, a lot of what we thought was absolute truth is laughable. But more importantly, today, a science reporter that's on the beat has to really understand molecular biology, microbiology, and a massive amount of protein biology.
I remember years ago listening to a radio broadcast in which you were walking through a market, probably near Kinshasa. But I don't recall that, but it was a story on AIDS, HIV. And you described the bushmeat, the raw meat that was simply hanging in markets, and speculated that if that meat itself was infected with the virus, how it might be transferred to humans, birds, insects, animals. What I remember about that is the brilliance of the idea to do that sort of on-the-ground reporting rather than rely only on statistics. Do those ideas come to you? Do you think them through? You're seeking the dramatic when you're looking for that kind of scientific explanation of a phenomenon?
Well, of course, you can tell a story better if people are engaged in the full dimensions of the story. In the case of radio, if they're hearing the atmosphere of the story.
And I remember the atmosphere.
I believe that was Tanzania.
Okay.
But same diff. Now, I also think that any good reporter, whether it's one of my colleagues covering ISIS in Syria right now, or it's a reporter covering city council meetings, if you're very, very good at your job, you're, first of all, skeptical of every absolute truth anybody tells you. And you're not just watching the main thing right in front of you. You're looking, who's sidebarring over there? You know, who's that guy talking to the city council woman from the East District?
And why?
And why? And you've got your eyes open. You know, I feel that one of the biggest things I got that I use every day in my work today, from having been trained in the sciences, is that I use the scientific method. So as a journalist, I would approach things with a hypothesis in my mind, and then you have to test it. Is it true? Do the facts jive? If the facts don't jive, abandon hypothesis, move on. Don't try to push. You know, the mistake a lot of very well-intended journalists make is that they latch on to a hypothesis or a cause or whatever you want to call it, and then don't let go of it. Try to make the facts fit it, rather than understand, hold back. Your job is to, analyze the empirical reality. And if your hypothesis is wrong, walk away from it. And this is, this involves removing your ego from the process.
So you've used that method, the scientific method, I think, in the 3 books you've written. And certainly 2 of the 3, but 3, and I want to hear about briefly about all of them. The Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance, it was 1994. Betrayal of Trust, The Collapse of Global Public Health, published in 2000. And I heard the sirens scream, how Americans responded to 9/11 and the anthrax attacks. What's the connection between them?
Public health.
Okay. Explain.
In all 3, the dangers are stated, the risks and threats, and it's very clear that the only real protection humanity has against that set of risks is a high-quality public health infrastructure. And unfortunately, in all too many cases, that infrastructure is either non-existent or deeply flawed. Usually deeply flawed for political reasons that relate to how politicians feel about the budget and about controversial decisions made by public health advocates.
And you're speaking, you're speaking globally, not simply in the United States.
Yes,
is that correct?
Absolutely. But everything I'm saying is as true in Kansas as Kinshasa.
So that may take us, hopefully logically, to the question of vaccination and the movement in this country for some parents to not vaccinate their children, and the consequent rise of illnesses that we thought had been 100% eliminated. Why do you think that happens?
Well, one of the things that I've accomplished at the Council on Foreign Relations is I created an interactive map. At the time we first launched it back in 2010, it had no similar phenomenon going on anywhere. We had to invent the software and so on. But we created an interactive map that allows you to track outbreaks of the 6 top childhood vaccine preventable diseases around the world. And you can track by country, region, disease, or time. So you have many dimensions to work in. And then we have an added 7th element you can track, and that is fatwas and physical attacks, assassinations of vaccinators.
Fatwas.
Fatwas.
Okay.
So what you see now, we're updating it every week. So it's unbelievably data rich. It's so data rich that we were having trouble, the system crashing all the time. And now you could look at it with your smartphone, anything. You just go to www.cfr.org and just type vaccine in the search box, and boom, you'll be there.
I'm not sure if we've put up that interactive map. We've learned from it. But I certainly recommend that everyone take a look at it. It's really a remarkable accomplishment.
There's three things that pop out. So it's filled with data that tracks 2008. So you've got almost 7 years of data. And three trends pop out, just, huge. One is the old trend of where were there outbreaks, why were there outbreaks, measles especially. And those all correlate with conflict zones or places of tremendous deprivation due to natural disasters, such as Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines,
right.
Which spawned an enormous measles epidemic. And we now know the Disneyland measles case, it connects somehow to the Philippines. So
really?
They've never found the one individual. Could have been an American tourist who went to the Philippines, came back. Could have been somebody's nanny. Who knows? So you have one phenomenon, which is what we've always dealt with since the history of vaccination, areas of tremendous deprivation and difficulty. And that is getting better. The international capacity to respond and vaccinate children is improving vastly. So that problem is shrinking, but it's still there. The second trend is what you see if you just look for pertussis, also known as whooping cough, or measles. Enormous outbreaks where? The United States, Canada, Western Europe. We've seen these diseases become diseases of the rich countries, and that all traces to Andrew Wakefield, a pseudoscientist, pseudo-physician, now thoroughly dishonored and lost his license to practice medicine from the UK, who claimed that he'd done an experiment on his son and some of his son's birthday guests, in which he was able to show that the ones that had received the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine were more likely to have autism.
We've done a number of programs in which Wakefield gets all the opprobrium he deserves. Let me ask you briefly.
Well, can I finish the third trend?
Please.
So there's the third trend, which really speaks to what we're dealing with today as our number one world crisis, in a sense, for U.S. foreign policy, and that is stems directly from two imams in northern Nigeria who in the early 2000s claimed they had evidence that HIV had been put in polio vaccines by the CIA and ordered all the households of what is now Boko Haram territory to stop vaccinating their children. Now, those imams lost power because Boko Haram actually thought they weren't politically correct and took over. And so far, Boko Haram, let's pray, knock on, if there were wood, I would knock on it.
It's all composite.
But it's all that stuff with formaldehyde. Anyway, they have so far not objected to vaccination. So, but it started there in Nigeria. The idea spread like a virus through the Islamist scene, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, a few other key pockets. Then one imam / Al-Qaeda affiliate in Pakistan issued a fatwa declaring that anyone who carried out vaccination for polio was an enemy of the Quran. And they assassinated the leader, the number one most famous polio vaccinator in all of Pakistan, in broad daylight, and nobody caught and nobody went to jail for it. That was bad, and we had this simmering problem. But then that idiot movie Zero Dark 30 came out, and incorrectly, the movie depicts Dr. Afridi, who's a real character, who actually really did collaborate with our
A real
CIA.
doctor, not just the
Yes.
movie character.
And he really did collaborate with our CIA. The plan the CIA had was, we need to confirm that in that compound there in Abbottabad
Right.
is Osama bin Laden. Let's go do a hepatitis vaccine campaign. And you inject and then you withdraw, and the needles will have DNA on them. And we'll rush them to, we have our standby biologist sitting in a bunker in Abbottabad, and we'll run a quick DNA test and we'll know, are those the bin Ladens? So this Dr. Afridi's job was to convince them to allow him to give vaccine. Zero Dark 30 incorrectly portrays it as a polio vaccine. Of course, you can't get DNA from an oral vaccine.
Right.
I mean, it was completely unbelievably horrible that she did this, and the director, and she even has him with a UNICEF symbol. Afridi, once all the story got out, Afridi went to prison. He's there forever in Pakistan for collaborating with a foreign power and so on. And the Zero Dark 30 just took off in the underground circuits, the black market all over Pakistan, India, and so on. And it became absolute proof that the polio vaccine was a CIA plot and so on. And since then, more than 600 individuals have been attacked, mostly in Pakistan, for attempting vaccination.
Is this the nature of the work you do at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, tracking these things and studying
It's
them?
an example. It's one of many things I do.
All right, this has been great. I really appreciate your joining us. Thank you, as always.
Thank you, Bob.
This has been a masterclass with Laurie Garrett, and she is a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And thank you for joining us at the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at NPF, where our mission is making good journalists better. Thanks.